welcome to my third Jenn and Friends LinkedIn Live. I know everyone's got a podcast or something live these days, but the whole reason I wanted to do this is to create a space for real talk to share the most current conversations on topics of work and life that we're all experiencing right now. So I'm super excited for this month's guest, Ron Friedman, an award-winning social psychologist and the founder of Ignite 80, a learning and development company that teaches leaders science-based strategies for building high-performance teams. Ron has done a whole bunch of stuff, has served on the faculty of the University of Rochester, Nazareth College, and Hobart and William Smith colleges, and is a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review, Psychology Today, Fast Company, Forbes, CNN. Popular accounts of his research have appeared on NPR and in major newspapers like the New York Times, Financial Times, The Globe and Mail, Washington Post, Guardian. Geez, Ron, what have you not been on? Men's Health, Entrepreneur, and Success. Basically, if you haven't read Ron's stuff, you haven't been reading. So his first book is The Best Place to Work, was named in Inc. magazine Best Business Book of the Year. And his new book, Decoding Greatness, How the Best in the World Reverse Engineer Success, was selected by Amazon's editors as one of 2021's best books. And he also has an ebook that we'll mention later as well. And it is called 10 Secrets for Leading High-Performing Teams. So with that, my goodness, Ron, before we deep dive into today's topic, which is a super timely one on mental health, I'd love to hear where you all are joining from. So feel free to comment in the section as you come in and give us any questions or ideas you have for us. But as we know, today is multiple days. It's also Indigenous Peoples Day, but also today is World Mental Health Day. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, not the band, has declared the year's theme, Make Mental Health and Well-Being a Global Priority for All. And basically a day to raise awareness around mental health, obviously. But why is this so timely? Why is this so important? According to the recent polls by Gallup, unhappiness is on the rise, no shocker. And in a APA American Psychological Survey Association survey, nearly 3 in 5 employees said they're experiencing negative impacts of work-related stress. Okay, so with all that talk, I will try to shut up because we want to hear from Ron. And one of the segments we've been doing that I really love because it just keeps things current and on the beat of what's happening in your head right now, Ron, in your life. What's on fire? So basically, what is on fire? What's firing you up right now? Whether it's personal or media related or workplace related, like what's firing up Ron today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. So what's
for having
firing me up is my team and I are about to go into the field for a follow-up study on what high-performing teams do differently. So we did a study during the pandemic where we interviewed over 1,000 office employees and asked them to rate their team. And we had them rate their team on 2 items. We said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your team's performance? And then we said, compared to other teams in your industry, where does your team fall? And again, we had them rate their team on a 1 to 10 scale. And then we took the people who were 10 out of 10 on both measures, and we categorized them as members of high-performing team, and then we compared them to everyone else. And so we found 3 really cool insights. One is that high-performing teams use the phone a lot more often. The second is that high-performing teams give and receive appreciation more often than average teams. And the third was that they're more authentic at work. They express both positive emotions more often, but they also express negative emotions more often. So they curse and they express sarcasm more frequently than average performers on average teams. And so the question is why? Why would high-performing teams express more negative emotions? And then the answer to that is because the alternative to expressing negative emotions is suppressing negative emotions. And suppressing negative emotions, which essentially means shielding the way you feel from your team members, that's cognitively expensive. And so the takeaway is, to the extent that we feel psychologically safe in being our real selves at work, team performance tends to improve. So the focus for the excitement for me and my team is around going into the field and now doing a second study to see what high-performing teams do differently.
Nice. I love that. I mean, those 2 words, psychological safety, was running in my head the whole time when you're talking about that. And it's just like so cool to know how much this term has been coming up with more frequency, and just as the norm of what we do or need to do.
Yes. And
Interesting about the calling thing, though.
what's that?
Interesting about the calling thing.
Yeah,
Like,
so
who calls?
60%, they make 60% more calls than
Mhm.
people on average teams, and so it's actually kind of really interesting because what happens. Well, first, let me take a step back. Why aren't people making phone calls? And this is a big issue with younger generations, and it's because there's an anticipation that getting on the phone with someone, one of your colleagues, is going to be an
Mm,
awkward or uncomfortable experience. And we have research showing that, in fact, getting on the phone is no more awkward than sending an email, but it leads to fewer misunderstandings, which thereby strengthens relationships. And that's what you're
mhm.
ultimately looking for. If you have a stronger relationship with your colleagues, your performance is going to increase.
Wow. That's super interesting.
Yeah.
I'll have to share that tidbit. Among the other things, like authenticity is huge for us. One of our core values is be true to your word self. And so, what I love what you shared about is like this ability to have that safety to share your highs and lows.
Right.
And one of the other questions that I have for every guest is, we went through the ringer, and some people have reflected and got wiser from it. And I'm guessing when you're one of those people that have done that. So I'm really curious in understanding our highs and lows of what happened to you personally since 2020 BC, before COVID, until
Mhm.
now. What might be one high or one low that you feel that you brought into this current state of what you've learned from?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because one of the things that I talk about in my book, my second book, Decoding Greatness, is I talk about
Mhm.
the importance of using a daily diary to reflect on what you learned that day. And so, one of the things I often do at the end of the day, in fact, I always do, is to think about what did I learn today, and what can how would I use that information to improve in the future. And
Mm.
so, if I were to reflect on in terms of career, a low, I guess, like many other thought leaders and speakers, speaking essentially disappeared for a good chunk
Mhm.
of the time. So that was a low. But in terms of the high, that led to this study, which I just described,
Yeah.
which was featured on Harvard Business Review and did really well. And then beyond that,
Awesome.
it also led my team and I to develop programs teaching leaders how to fuel their team's psychological needs and elevate performance. And so I
Hmm.
guess the key learning for me was whenever something bad happens, you can. It's okay to feel badly about it for in the short term, but
Hmm.
whenever you can transition away from that, the question to ask yourself is, what's the opportunity here? Because there's
Mhm.
always opportunity. And in the same way that you can always ask yourself, what can I learn from this? And just have taking that mindset of what can I learn from this really is. There's research on this showing that it takes the sting out of the negative experience because if you
Hmm.
view it as a learning opportunity, all of a sudden your mindset shifts towards viewing it as an opportunity for growth.
Hmm. That's huge. And because, a lot of people talk about these journals and gratitude and all that stuff, but like, I think it's not until people start doing it, they realize it actually works in all the things you said.
It does, but in fairness, so one of the things that people don't like to mention is
Yeah.
gratitude journals sometimes backfire. And the
Huh.
reason for that is if you all you're doing is identifying what you're grateful for after about, a few weeks, maybe a couple months, you're going to
Yeah.
run out of things to talk about. And that's going to lead you to say, "Hey, maybe my life isn't so great because I've got nothing else to write because I've already covered all the things to be grateful for." And so what I try to do is I try to focus on what can I learn from this because
Mm.
that question invariably leads to insights that I can apply to be smarter in the future. And the second part to this is I use a 5-year journal, which is allows you to see your entry for that same day the previous year. And
Hmm.
if you're able to do that, you're not just learning something new that day, you're also refreshing your memory of things that you've learned in the past.
Hmm. I love that. That's a good one. Um, how much, and then given this, like how much is this tying into, because you have such a wealth of tidbits on basically all these like these data points, this research you've been doing. Like, how does this all ladder up into how we should be prioritizing mental health for ourselves in a day-to-day basis?
Well, if you don't have mental health, you really can't do very much, right? And so for me, I try to focus on the essentials personally in my own life in terms of sleep, nutrition, uh,
Mm,
restoring my mental energy. And the way that I view it, and this is something I teach leaders a lot, is that the way to think about, for example, turning your phone off at the end of the day and disconnecting from work is not as something you selfishly do for yourself, but as an investment in your future performance. Because
Mm,
unless you're doing that, you're going to be reacting emotionally. And if you're reacting emotionally, then you're not going to be able to make rational, smart decisions in the future. And what a lot of leaders do is they try to elevate their alertness through caffeine. And
mhm,
caffeine will raise your alertness, but it will also raise your anxiety. And if you
mm,
are feeling more anxious at work, again, that's going to lead you to make more emotional, erratic decisions. And that's not sustainable over the long term.
mhm. What's really cool about how you're bringing these things up in leaders as well, like I just like the way you're phrasing it, it makes it really tangible and practical in a sense of like it's a reframe to curiosity of the lesson learned versus because I think sometimes people get a little bit too heady when we're trying to think about these concepts and how do you actually apply it in everyday life. So I think that's super cool. I'm curious now about you because you're a psychologist, but you have spent a lot of time focusing on the workplace, and your first book was about the best place to work. So how was that? How did that transpire within you to get to that particular angle of psychology? And yeah, if you can expand on that.
Yeah, I actually had no interest in writing about the workplace.
Those
The
are the
way
best
that
times.
the way that it happened for me was that I studied social psychology, which is the all about how our environment, so other people around us, shape the way that we think, feel, and act. And then I decided, you know what, I've had enough of academics. I'm going to join the corporate world. And the reason I did that was because I loved learning new things. And what happens is when you become a professor and you're teaching classes, you're not really learning the same new things. You're just kind of teaching the same thing over and over again. So I
Mm,
decided, okay, I want to get out of here and I'm going to get a corporate job. So my job was to measure public opinion and advise organizations on how they can utilize those insights to shape public opinion using psychological principles.
mm,
And I loved the job. It was fantastic. But one of the things that struck me when I got to the corporate world was the divide between the factors that we psychologists know lead people to perform at a high level, to be motivated, to be creative, to be engaged, and how most organizations operate. And
mm.
so I decided to take a risk, quit my job. I got a book deal. And I'm kind of like the last person, Jen, to get a book deal without having any platform. I had no website. I didn't even have a Twitter account. I just wrote a proposal. My agent was able to sell it through to Penguin Random House.
Uh-huh.
And so I just spent a year writing a book. And in that book, I took over 1,000 academic articles and I translated them into plain English so that
Wow.
regardless of where you are, whether you're a CEO or just someone starting out, you had access to the best insights on how to create a great workplace and also elevate your performance at work. And at the core of that book is something called self-determination theory, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Mhm.
Uh, the folks that I studied with in grad school are Ed Deci and Richard Ryan, and their theory is all about what are the factors that we need in order to be healthier, happier, more productive. And
Mm,
what they've identified are three basic human psychological needs. So they're the need for mastery or competence, some people call this. And it's the idea that we need to feel like we're growing on a regular basis. The
mhm,
second is the need for relatedness. So feeling like we're connected to others in a meaningful way. And the third is the need for autonomy. So feeling like you have some say in how you do your job. And so when we have our basic human psychological needs fulfilled, the need for mastery, relatedness, and autonomy, we tend to be much more productive at work. The
mm.
challenge is that most organizations do a dreadful job of fueling our psychological needs, which is why I'm focused on teaching leaders the best
Mm.
science on how you can bring that to your organization.
That's awesome. What's really cool though is like you're naming these three elements that they're like directly analogous to the scientific levers of happiness,
Mm.
and which we talked about in Delivering Happiness, the book, and what we do. But like, it's so cool to see how all these there's maybe different terminology, different language, but it all comes back to the same ultimate higher goals. So Laura Putnam thinks your book is a great book, by the way, just FYI. And Sally, thank you for the comment on the hat. This has been glued to my head since COVID. So thank you. All right. Well, what I'm curious about, that best place to work when you wrote that versus now,
Mhm.
like what are the shifts you've seen in the context of today's work environment?
Well, obviously, much has changed in the last 8 years since that book came out. But one of the things that is striking to me is the extent to which nothing has changed. And so, yeah, we can talk about how we're working from home and how, or many of us now are where we weren't before, and how technology has really affected every aspect of our life. But the truth is that we're still not getting our psychological needs fulfilled, which is why you see trends like quiet quitting, which is really kind of a media generated term for
Yeah.
disengagement at work. It's synonymous. There's not much different. I guess in some circumstances you could talk about people withholding or not doing the bare minimum, but that's kind of what disengagement means, right? It's
Yeah.
what you need. Otherwise, you would quit. So quiet quitting is just a new term for an age-old um, uh, finding in the research. And what the research shows is if you want to lift people's engagement at work, then you really need to focus on fueling these psychological needs. The challenge for a lot of leaders is it's one thing to know about these things on a theoretical basis and something completely different in terms of
Mm.
how do I, as a leader, make you, my employee, feel like the work you're doing is your choice? Or what do I, as a leader, need to do to get people to feel like they're connected to others? And so
Mm.
the shift in the thinking that needs to happen is that this is not top down. In other words, as I mentioned with high performing teams,
Yeah.
the appreciation doesn't come just from the leader. They're expressing it to one another on a peer to peer basis. And so, what we're talking about here is creating a culture where
Mm.
psychological needs are fueled. And there are some very key specific things that any leader can do to make that happen. And that's what I'm focused on teaching.
Mm. I'm curious what you think. Like I totally agree. Like these things, it's sad. It's like it's not new. It's just maybe a new frame or new phrasing of it. But do you think having the term quiet quitting, which I think is a terrible branding job, of what it really means, is really more of a cry for help? Like maybe a different sort of angle on disengagement because it does sound more from the cry from a mental health perspective as an individual versus just general disengagement. So do you feel like in some ways that like just the fact that quiet quitting exists as a term is indicative of what's happening in our mental health space at work?
It's interesting. I think it's a great question. I don't think anybody as an employee is going around saying, I'm quiet quitting today because they don't,
Mhm.
I mean, employees don't think that way. That's a media generated term, for better or for worse. But I do think that when we talk about the workplace in general, um, there's a level of specificity that we're ignoring. And what I mean by that is like if you compare a retail worker or a fast food worker to someone who's sitting in an office or working at home, um,
Mm.
that's a very different experience. And so just to be clear, like I can appreciate that quiet quitting is going on in some of these um, lower paying jobs for a variety of different reasons for why it's happening or disengagement is happening on the white collar job level. And so
Mhm.
we lump all these terms together and we're like, well, this is the problem. It's the fact that people can't disconnect from work. Well, it's a far different problem for someone who's who's trying to hold down three jobs. So if we're
Yeah.
just going to focus on white collar jobs, I'm happy to do that. But let's be clear that we're doing that. And when we're doing that, we have to talk about what are the factors that are different. What are the factors that differ from in terms of quiet quitting versus the Great Resignation? Obviously, the economic
Mm.
conditions were different, but isn't it aren't both trends being fueled by the same factors? And I would argue
Mhm.
that it is.
Yeah.
And maybe we've gone from the Great Resignation to quiet quitting, not because there's something fundamental that's different in the worker experience, but because economic changes have fueled the different terminologies.
Hmm. That's interesting. So what might be the if you were just like a crystal ball, what the next term might be?
Oh, the next term?
Yeah.
Uh, Well, the next term is unfortunately people trying to hold on to their jobs. Certainly, quiet quitting and the Great Resignation are going to sound really nice if the trend continues. Hopefully, it doesn't. But what I will say, if we are willing to make the case, for the sake of this informal conversation, Jen, if we want to make the case that these are the same trends, then what we do have is we do have some good research on what are the factors that drove the Great Resignation. And
Mhm.
one study that I looked at very recently showed that well, let me take a step back. What they did was they interviewed people who quit their job and took a new job during the Great Resignation, and they asked them what were the factors that drove you out of your initial job. And
Mhm.
87% of people agreed that they weren't learning anything new in their old
Mhm.
job. That falls directly underneath mastery.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things I talk about in the best place to work is if working for you is too easy, you're doing something wrong. And that is very
Mhm.
counter to the way that most leaders think about their job. They think they need to make the work as simple as possible for their employees because that way They won't complain, they won't be stressed out. But the
Mm,
reality is, unless you're stressing people on a certain level and they're not learning new things, they're not being challenged at work, they're not going to be
right.
fully engaged. And one of the things that leaders are often taught in business schools is to optimize for efficiency, because if workers are more efficient, they'll get more done, and then that will improve profits. But efficiency is not the same thing as engagement. And so all you're doing is having
Mm,
people do the same thing over and over again. They're going to
right.
grow bored, and they're going to go disengaged, and they're going to look for challenges either in their personal life or look for a new job.
Mm. It sounds a lot like flow. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's flow. Like basically, peak flow would be level of skill with level of challenge, and that's when you're like, woo, in your zone.
Absolutely. And if you're a leader, what you need to start thinking about is, are the people on my team being challenged? And if they're not, what can I do to get them in that zone of growth, as opposed to just coasting by? Because
Yeah.
when what happens when people coast is that they go disengaged, job becomes predictable, and they look for that sense of challenge somewhere else in their life.
hmm And I mean, I'm totally aligned with everything you're saying, because I think one thing that we can say with certainty is like coming out of not that we're completely out of it yet, but the last 2.5 years, I think there's one thing that we can all agree on is that we all still want to grow, like no matter what, where we are in any sort of uh, categorical way. But I'm so big about this whole idea. I think just being holed up for so long, people are feeling that way. I want to shift gears to your second book, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
Decoding Greatness.
Mhm.
And it's about strategies for top performers, what they use to get ahead. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So in Decoding Greatness, what I was focused on is that one of those three needs, mastery, and how do we improve the extent to which we're growing at work on a regular basis in our own lives. And so the big
Mhm.
idea for Decoding Greatness is that the way that we've been taught about how top performers reach the top of their field is actually incomplete. I would say is we've been given two big stories about how people reach the top of their professions, and that's how we define how top performance happens. And the two big ideas, the two big stories that we've all been told are, number one, that uh, top performance and greatness comes from talent. The idea that we're all born with certain strengths, and that the key to finding your greatness is just find a field that allows your strengths to shine. Right? That's the strength finder approach.
Mhm.
Then there is the second big idea is that greatness comes from practice. This is the 10,000 hour Malcolm Gladwell outlier idea, that if you
Yeah.
just have the right practice routine, then
Mhm.
eventually, and you have enough discipline to do it, then eventually you'll rise to the top of your profession. So those are the two big ideas, practice and talent. But there's a third story, and that's what Decoding Greatness is all about. That in the third story is that, in fact, the people who reach the top of their professions aren't necessarily the people who are practicing more or necessarily more talented, but rather they're the people who are finding extraordinary performances in their field or extraordinary examples, and then
Mhm.
working backward to figure out how those works were created. And that's the idea of reverse engineering. And reverse
Mhm.
engineering, it turns out to be far more common than any of us appreciate, to the extent where it's not just happening in the world of business and technology, but it also is happening on the level of Stephen King and Malcolm Gladwell. That's how they learned how to write, and Claude Monet and
Mhm.
Vincent Van Gogh. That's how they learned to paint. And even someone as well known as Judd Apatow. That's how he learned to write comedy. And so
Mhm.
finding great examples and then asking yourself, how is this created? What can I learn from this? How do I apply this to my next project? That turns out to be a far more common approach than simply relying on practice or coasting on talent.
Hmm. Wow. So how would you advise leaders to implement that?
Well, one great suggestion I think is creating a hall of fame within your company. And what I mean
Mm.
by that is find extraordinary examples of proposals, of presentations, and start finding ways of highlighting that so that people can look at those examples, figure out
Mm.
how they were created, and then go there for inspiration. So I talk about this as creating your own personal museum. You can do this on the organizational level, but you can also do this in your own life. So if you come
Mm.
across an amazing landing page or an amazing newsletter, start filing that away. So when it's time for you to create your own landing page or your own newsletter, you can look at those examples and ask yourself, what can I learn from this? And how do I apply this to my work?
I love that. Very, very practical. That's so cool.
Yeah.
So going back to the whole mental health day, it's like Finally, right? Like, if anything, as my brother says, don't let a good pandemic go to waste. So how are we gonna let's not gonna let it go to waste. Now mental health, I mean, it's basically last 2.5 years just blew the covers, and it was already there. Burnout, we knew, just engagement, as we've been talking about, we knew, and then quiet quitting, new form, and then overall increase of unhappiness and stress and anxiety. So now that like the spotlights are truly on it, mental health, what do you think are just like top 2 to 3 things that as a leader, and when I say leader, I mean everyone, like
Mhm.
we're a leader in our own work life. And so what are maybe 2 or 3 things that we can take control of now in this mental health space, knowing it's such a huge topic and unwieldy, sometimes hard to, grasp? What do you think?
Well, we talked about the use of a 5-year journal, and I think
Mhm.
another way of thinking about that is to use the opportunity to self-reflect and ask yourself, kind of think about like what are you excited by, what is bringing you down, and to hold those emotions up and recognize that emotions have value in that they're giving you feedback on
Mhm.
what what's going on for you. So if you are unhappy about something, if you're frustrated by something, that, I think I'm sure I wouldn't lump you in here, Jen, because I don't think this is you at all. But I think a lot of the time when people go and talk about happiness, the idea I think that people walk away from is that negative emotions should be ignored, or at least they should be suppressed. And I
Mhm.
need to be happy. And that's a lot of pressure to put on yourself, is to say, I need to be happy all the time because happiness is associated with all these positive outcomes. Well, the truth is we talked about how having psychological safety is key for a team to perform at their best. Having the
Yeah,
psychological safety to face up to your emotions personally is just as critical.
totally.
And
Totally.
so when you are experiencing negative emotion, rather than suppressing them, ask yourself, what's going on here? Why am I feeling this way? And what can I learn from this? And again, if you take that learning mindset, then
Mm.
experiencing those negative emotions becomes a little bit less painful, because now you know that the insight you're about to uncover is going to help you improve in the future.
Mm. Thank you for clarifying that, and thank you for recognizing I don't believe that there's not there's a reason why the book's called Beyond Happiness, because it's about those lows, and I love that, in the way you're just infusing that, and you've been doing it for so long, so effectively. Laura continues to say that something that you do really well, Ron, so you got a big fan in Laura. Hi, Laura. So in the same APA survey that we just shared earlier, about 87% of employees think actions from their employer would help their mental health. And we've seen a big gap. I think Deloitte had a recent study that showed, I think 70 something percent of CEOs think that they're prioritizing well being for their people, and only 50 something percent of the employees think they are. So
Mm.
huge gap, 30 something percentage points. What do you think? Workplace and leaders should do to provide that level of actually walking the talk of prioritizing well-being and psychological safety environment to support it.
Yeah. So we talked about the three psychological needs.
Mhm.
I'm never going to walk away from that, because I feel like that really is the key. So if
Yeah.
you can get people feeling like they're growing at work, like they're connected and appreciated and valued by their colleagues, and they have some choice in how they do their job, you're going to see all of these metrics improve, because we know from the research, like, this is what prevents turnover. This is what fuels
Mhm.
engagement. This is what also heightens creativity and performance. And so psychological needs are key. But the truth is that you can have all the psychological needs in the world, and it's not going to be enough
Mhm.
um, if you yourself as an individual are staring at a computer all the time, or you're glued to your smartphone. Like, it's just, we know from the research that being able to disconnect is key, and so is exercise. And so when it comes to
Mhm.
fostering positive mental health, one of the smartest things managers and leaders can do is to model the right behaviors within their organizations. And so we're talking
Mhm.
about, like, get some exercise or take some walking meetings and talk about how you are prioritizing exercise in your life. And you're not doing it because you're a nice person. You're doing it because you're going to elevate performance by doing so. But
Yeah.
beyond that, it's modeling the right behaviors in terms of disconnecting from work. And so one of my favorite examples of a workplace that's taking this seriously is I think it's yeah, it's BMW, where they turn off the server. in the evenings, so that
Huh.
you can send an email at 11:30 at night, but your employees are not going to get it until 7:30 the following morning. And I think that's just so wise. And in the latest operating system update on the iPhone, you can actually do this yourself. If you
Mm.
hold down the send button on email, it'll ask you when you want the email delivered. And
I
so you can
noticed
take
that.
your own hands right now and do the right thing for your employees.
Yeah. I noticed that, and I don't know. Personally, I love the fact that you can unread text messages because that was driving me bonkers for like decades.
And oh, that's
Yeah,
reading now.
now the iPhone is really worth it. um, I know, like you're a fan of art. I am as well, and I think you had a recent article about how going to an art museum or even looking at art online for a few moments can increase your overall well-being. Like I think that's probably one of the reasons why I love going to Burning Man, because it's just like immersive. But the playa desk gets a little annoying. But anyways, give us a little better, a deeper sense of that. Like, what is it that causes that for us within something like art?
Well, exposure to beauty in general makes us happy, and it has a physiological reaction. And so, if you're looking at
Mm,
art, it's been shown to lower your level of cortisol. It fosters more endorphins, and so physiologically, there's something going on when you see something beautiful. The challenge in a lot of organizations is that the artwork doesn't change, right? Like it's the same artwork if you're walking through the hallways that you've been looking at for years. And so, one of the recommendations I have for organizations is to rent their artwork and have it shift every few months, because unless it's novel, people aren't going to be paying attention. So you can actually apply this insight uh,
mm,
to your organization by updating the art every few months. And they're typically, like, museums are happy to do this if you can actually rent the artwork on the
mm,
walls. And so you get the novelty, but it doesn't just, it's not just for the sake of making people happier. It actually leads them to be more creative, because when you're looking at artwork, it opens your eyes up to new possibilities, new
mm.
opportunities. And
So does it? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, that's okay.
Oh, so does it have to be like physical artwork? Like what about NFTs?
Definitely not NFTs. Don't get me
Just
started
wondering.
on NFTs.
I mean, some
But
people
I
say
thought you were gonna go a
30
different direction, which is like nature. Nature works.
Yeah.
Pictures of nature. You can bring in an aquarium where you could see fish swimming around.
Mhm.
Like that works. NFTs yet to be determined. Unlikely.
Had to ask. I mean, they're being valued pretty high. It's
Yeah.
funny you bring this up because I went to go visit a colleague's office last week, and I hadn't been there in years. And there's art everywhere, but it's the same damn art as I've seen like 8 years ago. And I'm like, this tattered U.S. flag is not working anymore. Like, give me something different. It has to change.
Yes.
Um, okay, we're just gonna wrap things up. Thank you everyone for your comments. I have one final question, and I love to talk about living legacies. It's
Mhm.
kind of like, how do you actually live fulfilling, and not just your highs but your lows, and appreciating our own legacy today, not not after it's too late, obviously. So just curious how you, and you're doing it in so many different ways. Like, how do you like what's one way you're living your legacy in the now?
That's a loaded question. I don't know if I would have a simple answer, but what I will say is that I'm a big fan of long-term thinking.
Mm,
And so anything I create, I am endlessly focused on, like, is this going to be valuable in 30 years? Now, that's a big question because things
mm,
change so quickly. But I try to only create programs and keynotes and trainings that are going to be live on forever, because they're grounded in psychological principles. Now, does that foster a legacy? I don't know. I hope so. It's certainly better
mhm,
than living in the now. And I've noticed this. You're a writer, Jen, so you know this. Like, if you have references in your writing to things that are going on right now, there's no better way of sinking the relevance of your book 10 years from now. And so I've learned that lesson after having some examples in my first book that
yeah.
maybe are no longer quite as applicable. Like, I gave the example of how risk taking is actually really valuable, and it's a numbers game. So the more risks you take, the more successes you have. And I gave this as an example of Donald Trump. I wrote, I wrote, nobody sees all the people who rejected Donald Trump. All they see is Melania Trump. And
Mm.
that turned out to be maybe a little bit of an overreach. But anyway, so I always try to think of what's going to be valuable in 10 or 20 or 30 years.
Nice. I should have talked to you before writing Beyond Happiness, because
You have an example that no longer.
Well, I mean, it's just because I started writing it January, February of 2020. And so you can imagine every time I freaking turn on the news, this is like, oh, damn it. But anyways, good to know for the next one.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Ron, thank you so much for your time. I would love to talk to you more about this because this, as you know, a big passion of mine and how we can impact people's lives through the workplace, but also through mental health. So hopefully we can continue the conversation and let us know however we can support all your amazing endeavors. Reminder of Ron's free ebook, and I think AJ put that in the chat too, but 10 Secrets for Leading High Performance Teams. The link is in the chat from Ignite 80 and Ron Friedman. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Come back next time. Let us know what you'd like to hear about, any feed forward that you have. And Ron, please come back and visit, and hopefully we can do good stuff together in the future.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Jen.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.